Types of motor pathways. There are two types of motor pathways, the direct pyramidal and the indirect extrapyramidal. The pyramidal and extrapyramidal motor pathways are two distinct systems of our CNS, and they control the voluntary movement. The pyramidal motor pathways are also known as the corticospinal tract. They're also known as the corticospinal tract, and they originate in the cerebral cortex and descends through the brainstem and spinal cord to directly innervate the lower motor neurons that control the muscle. These are responsible for the fine and skilled motions of the body, like writing or playing an instrument. The indirect pyramidal motor pathways, on the other hand, is a complex network of neural circuits that originate from the basal ganglia and the brainstem, and they also regulate and modulate the lower motor neurons. They're more related to maintaining posture, balance, coordinated motion, and lesions to these areas can cause you to have tremors, rigidity, and reduced ability to muscle contract. So right here you can see some of the key ones, like the lateral corticospinal tract, the ventral anterior corticospinal tract. These are the pyramidal tracts. The extrapyramidal tracts are on the outside. We have the rubrospinal tract, reticulospinal tract, olivospinal tract, and vesibulospinal tract. The direct pyramidal tracts. The axons split into the corticobulbar or the corticospinal tracts. The corticobulbar and the corticospinal tract. The corticobulbar tracts consist of nerve fibers that innervate the muscles of the face and head, while the corticospinal tracts consist of nerve fibers that innervate the muscles of the body and limbs. The corticobulbar tract originate in the motor cortex of the brain and descends down the brainstem, where it synapses to the lower motor neurons, and those control the face and the head. These tracts control the facial expressions, speech, and swallowing. These go to the face. The corticospinal tracts descend through the brainstem, where it synapses with motor neurons that control the body and limbs, and they're involved with writing, playing an instrument, manipulating small objects. It should be noted that some axons in the corticospinal tract decuss, which means they cross over at the medulla oblongata. The lateral corticospinal tracts do decuss, and they innervate mostly the appendicular skeletal muscle, whereas the ventral corticospinal tracts do not decuss, and they mainly innervate the axial skeletal muscle, or the body's muscle. This is important to be aware of. So here's a chart that organizes the overview of the corticobulbar versus corticospinal tracts. The corticobulbar tracts and the corticospinal tracts are all from the motor cortex. The location where they cross over for the corticobulbar is in the pons. The location where they decuss for the corticospinal tract are typically at the level of the spinal cord. The location where they innervate with the lower motor neurons for the corticobulbar tracts are going to be at the cranial nerves. And the corticospinal tracts synapse with lower neurons at the specific ventral horn of the spinal cord. The corticobulbar tracts control the face, whereas the corticospinal tracts control the body, axioskeletal muscle, and then the lateral corticospinal tracts control the limbs. So let's take a look at an example of a direct pyramidal tract. So this is an example of how you extend your wrist. So the upper motor neuron initiates signals from the upper part of the brain. The upper neurons then combine down through the brain through the corona radiata, and they travel through the internal capsule of the cerebellum. They're going to then be able to get into the pons right in the middle region and split into two groups. They will then cross over, so the right side goes to the left and left side goes to the right, and they go down into the medulla oblongata. Then down the lateral corticospinal tracts, they travel through the spinal cord to about C5 and T1. And now this is where the upper lower motor neurons synapse, and the lower motor neurons leave the spinal cord from the ventral part, and they exit into the arm through the brachial plexus. One branch of the brachial plexus becomes the radial nerve, and then the radial nerve innervates down to the wrist muscles like the extensor carpi radialis brevis, extensor digitorum, to allow the wrist to be extended. Let's take a look at extrapyramidal tracts. And now the indirect or extrapyramidal tracts are a set of neural pathways that originate in the brainstem and are involved in regulation of posture, balance, and coordinated movement. Unlike the direct tracts, these ones synapse directly with the lower motor neurons. So one example is going to be the vesibulospinal tract, which originates in the vestibulonuclei of the brainstem and descends through the spinal cord to modulate the lower motor neurons that control balance and posture. The lateral vestibulospinal tract, this is where the upper motor neurons originate on the lateral side of the medulla and pons. They synapse with the lower motor neurons of the spinal cord, and they control postural muscles. We also have the medial vestibulospinal tract. That is where the upper motor neurons originate in the medial vestibulonuclei of the medulla and pons, and they synapse directly at the ventral horn of the spinal cord, so right here. So the key functions for these are going to be balance, posture, and coordinating with eye movements. Let's take a look at another extrapyramidal tract, the reticulospinal tract. There are two major divisions of the reticulospinal tract. There's going to be the pontine reticulospinal tract, called the PRST, and the medullary reticulospinal tract, called the MRST. We're just going to generalize the reticulospinal tracts here. They originate from the pontine reticular formation inside the brain and facilitates muscle tone, posture, locomotion, and some of the stimulus-driven muscle movements. They exert control over the skeletal muscle and the ANS. The medial region will mostly affect the extensor muscles, while the lateral side is going to inhibit these extensor muscles. So these two have to work closely to allow the muscles to contract and relax. The pontine reticular formation right here, that tract shown here goes down all the way through to the spinal cord, go directly to the ear neurons before they go to the muscle. Another extrapyramidal tract is called the rubrospinal tract. The rubrospinal tract originates in the red nucleus of the midbrain and travels down the spinal cord and controls voluntary movement. The red nucleus receives information from the supracortex, the cerebellum, and travels through that rubrospinal tract to influence the motor neurons in the spinal cord. It is involved in controlling movement of the opposite side of the body, specifically in maintaining the fine motor controls of our limbs and our hands. And whenever there's damage to this tract, it can cause spasms, weakness, and motor impairments. So it starts in the red nucleus, innervates mostly the flexion motion muscles, and the tract decusses and travels down the lateral column tract in the lateral corticospinal tract. So you can see right here, it goes from the red nucleus. Some of these neurons can come from the superior colliculus for visual cues, comes in, goes down to the rubrospinal and rubroreticular tracts. And we have the tectospinal tract and tectobulbar tracts as well. And they synapse with the lower motor neurons at the ventral horn. The last extrapyramidal tract we'll talk about is the tectospinal tract. These ones have a fine control for the head in response to mostly visual stimuli. They receive information from the optic nerve and originates from the superior colliculus of the midbrain. Some fibers can cross over, some do not, and the main function is that it synapses with the lower motor neurons right at about C1 to C4. So right at the neck region is where these nerves control the optic information and visual cue. So summarizing what we said with the extrapyramidal indirect tracts is that we have vesibulospinal tract. This one is going to start from the vestibular nuclei of the medulla oblongata and pons. It does not decuss. Main function is to control posture. The vestibulospinal tract is going to come from the also medulla oblongata and pons, also does not decuss. Main function is to control the neck muscles. The reticular spinal tracts are going to come from the pontine reticular formation. They do not decuss, and its main function is to control the extensor muscles. The reticular spinal tracts on the lateral side is going to come from the medullary reticular formation, does not decuss, and main function is to inhibit extensor muscles. And then the rubrospinal tracts are going to come from the red nucleus, and they do cross over after the red nucleus, and main function is to control flexion motion of muscles. And the tectospinal tracts is going to come from the superior colliculus of the midbrain for visual cues, located at C1 to C4, and maintains movement of the head. So here's an example of an indirect extrapyramidal pathway. So let's say knee extension. You want the knee to kick, so you have a knee-jerk reaction where the upper motor neurons in the reticular formation send signals down, and the upper motor neurons descend down the ventral column of the spinal cord, and they do not decuss. The upper motor neurons are going to directly interact with the lower motor neurons, L2 to L4 region, and this becomes part of the lumbar plexus. One of the branches of the lumbar plexus becomes the femoral nerve that comes all the way down to the quadricep muscles, and when you hit that kneecap, it's going to cause this muscle to contract.